Hi, and welcome to our first lecture for History 111, U.S. History 1. Today we're going to focus on North America in the pre-colonial period and the early colonial period. When we use the term pre-colonial period, we're talking about the period before the mid-1500s, before the first major European settlements came about in what is now North America. When we talk about the early colonial period, we're talking generally about the period of time from the mid-1500s through the mid-1600s. The earliest part of that colonial period that existed from the 1500s throughout the 1700s. So today we're going to focus on some of the early settlements from Europe and then focus in on the two most important early English settlements in North America. Before we talk about European settlement in North America, we need to recognize the importance of indigenous peoples in the Western Hemisphere. Evidence suggests that indigenous peoples lived in what is now Florida and Chile as much as 14,500 years ago. When we consider the fact that the United States itself as a country is barely 250 years old, we realize that indigenous people existed in what is now North America and South America for a much, much longer period of time. It's important to recognize that these indigenous peoples were not one unified group, but rather a diverse group of human beings with very diverse cultures and identities. Indigenous peoples in the Western Hemisphere spoke hundreds of different languages, not simply one language. They also existed in many different social and economic forms. So there were hunter and gathering groups that we typically associate with indigenous people in the Western Hemisphere. However, as early as 1200 BC, there were agricultural social structures in North and South America, well before Europeans came to the New World, so to speak, or to the Western Hemisphere and created agricultural settlements. People were already doing that here well before the advent of the major European settlements that we're going to talk about in just a moment. It's also important to recognize that alongside these agricultural settlements, you did have nomadic groups and hunter and gathering societies, hunting and gathering societies, I should say. Some of these groups emerged into large-scale population centers, or what we might think of as cities, during this period. And at the same time, you had groups that often migrated depending on the season. Despite a great deal of differences among native cultures, historians generally talk about some commonalities between all of these groups or among all of these groups. There was no clear distinction between the natural world and the supernatural world, between the here and now on earth and some spiritual realm. That's very different from Christian culture, which predominated the thinking of Europeans at the time and still dominates much of Western thinking today. In Christianity and other Western religions, there's a distinction between the earthly realm and the spiritual realm. That wasn't the case among most indigenous societies and cultures. There was a different understanding when it came to property. There was an understanding that the land was there for humans' use, but not for permanent possession. Again, very different from European society where the possession of land determined one's wealth, one's status, and one's political influence. Indigenous cultures were often structured around matrilineal kinship ties as opposed to patrilineal kinship ties. So when you have a matrilineal culture, the culture is organized around the mother's bloodline and family line, not the father's. If you think about our culture in the United States today, and even many other Western cultures, the family is structured around patrilineal descent, the way that you inherit your father's last name, for example. You don't inherit your mother's maiden name, you inherit your father's name. That's a patrilineal culture. There was also greater sexual freedom, and divorce was much more common than it was in European culture. You have to stop and remember that when it came to countries such as England, Spain, and Portugal, they continued to be dominated during this period by the Catholic Church. And even today, the Catholic Church does not recognize divorce as an option. What happened to these indigenous people? Well, of course, we still have descendants that are alive and well today and part of the American fabric. But sadly, we also need to recognize that within 100 years of the arrival of Europeans, as much as 95% of the population of indigenous people was lost. Much of this was due to disease. Now, of course, there are other factors like violence, the dispossession of people from their land, but the biggest culprit was disease. And how did this happen exactly? Well, in European populations, you had much more contact in big cities throughout Europe. People lived closer together, people interacted much more closely, and large populations in small areas was fairly common. That was not as common in indigenous culture in North and South America. So when diseases such as smallpox, the mumps, the measles, influenza were brought to North America from Europe, there was not a biological resistance built up among the indigenous population. So sadly, many perished because of these diseases that we now think of as not as much of a big deal. But smallpox, influenza, in other words, the flu, the mumps, and measles wiped out entire populations. So again, 95% of indigenous people were lost due mainly to disease. So we'll talk now about European settlements and how that emerged. Although in this course we're going to focus mostly on English culture, English history, and how that evolved into the modern day United States, we should also recognize that England was really kind of late to the game. So before there were English settlements, there were French settlements in North America and Spanish settlements. But going back just a step further, before the major European settlements emerged in North America, you had a settlement as early as 1000 AD by Leif Erikson, and he had founded a Norse colony in what is now Newfoundland, Canada. The colony eventually failed, in part due to the pushback and resistance among native peoples. In 1565, Spanish explorers had founded the first permanent European settlement in North America, namely St. Augustine, Florida, now considered an American city, right? This was initially a city founded by Spanish explorers. Though French traders and trappers had come much earlier, Quebec City, in what is modern-day Canada, was the first French settlement and was founded in 1608. The first English settlement in Jamestown, Virginia, which we'll talk about in much more detail today, was founded in 1607. Less than a decade later, Plymouth was founded in 1620. The Massachusetts Bay Colony was subsequently founded in 1630, with settlement in Connecticut and Rhode Island soon to follow in 1636. The first Dutch arrived in 1609. We tend to think of New York as one of the initial English colonies, but New York was first settled and established by the Dutch. And this happened, again, early in the 1600s, 1609 to be exact. But the English would eventually take control of New York in the mid-1600s. So now we'll focus on some of the major settlements here in North America that were English colonial settlements. By the end of the 1500s, huge population growth in England and the transition from crop-based agriculture to livestock created extreme and widespread poverty, as well as an extreme land shortage and an extreme uptick in the cost of land. This would place an emphasis on seeking land and economic opportunities outside of England. So as people began to move from growing crops primarily to raising livestock, cattle, sheep, etc., they realized there was much more of a premium on land, right? This did two things. It created the increased value of land and drove up property prices so that not everybody had access to land. But more importantly, it created a land shortage because to raise livestock, you need bigger tracts of land. So this created a need and a motivation for people to go beyond England and eventually beyond Europe to search for opportunities outside of England. At the same time, England, which, as I said before, was kind of late to the game as far as colonial powers went, they realized that their chief rival, Spain, was both getting much more wealthy and gaining a lot of economic benefits from their colonizing of the New World, so to speak. But they also realized that that was a concerted advantage when it came to their military power. So England realizes in this period that they need to begin to keep up and follow the example of the Spanish, the French, the Portuguese, and other European colonial powers. Unlike French and Spanish colonial domination, which sought to convert indigenous populations to Catholicism, England modeled its New World expansion on the model of subordination and control, which it had successfully used in the colonization of Ireland. We need to remember that during this period of time, England was no longer a Catholic country. Under Henry VIII in the early 1500s, the Anglican Church was formed, or what's also known as the Church of England. To this day, there is no separation between church and state in England, as there is, or at least there is supposed to be, in the United States. Right? And England became a Protestant country beginning in the 1500s under Henry VIII. That's different from Spain, France, Portugal, and most other European powers, which were still under Catholic rule and influence. So, under British control, Ireland had been largely colonized by the British, and the Irish people were predominantly Irish Catholic, but they were controlled by Protestant English, the Protestant English, and by people who were not Catholic. And so in Ireland, the Catholic population was largely colonized. So England simply took that model and imported that model, and that had a strong influence on the way that they looked at native populations here, and led to much more of a sense of conquering people rather than converting people to one's way of life or one's religious norms and values. The Jamestown expedition was founded as a profit-oriented business venture. The Virginia Company was founded in 1606 and resulted in the Jamestown settlement founded in 1607. So from the beginning, this was primarily a profit motivated venture or expedition. This was not about religious freedom. This was not about anything but making money. That was the primary motivation here. A little bit different when we talk about the experience in New England, which was motivated in large part by religion. So the Jamestown Company, founded in 1606, creates the settlement of Jamestown in 1607, and it is a profit-making venture. Jamestown was founded on land which had been abandoned by the indigenous people who occupied this area. Largely, it was a piece of land that was not agreeable for farming and was really difficult to survive on. Now, of course, that wasn't the case with later settlements where native peoples were often violently dispossessed of land. But in this particular instance, this was founded on land that had been abandoned because it was basically useless. Another factor that was important here is these English settlers in Jamestown were basically well-to-do gentlemen, unused to hard labor, and they found it difficult to grow food and to survive in the first couple years of the settlement. Less than a decade later, only 20% of English settlers survived. The successful planting of tobacco would eventually transform the settlement into a profitable and valuable enterprise. This increased the desire for land, because the more land you had, the more money you could make by growing tobacco, and it increased the demand for human labor. So this eventually would prompt an increased reliance on indentured servitude, which we will get into in a future lecture, and eventually chattel slavery, which we will also talk about in the next couple weeks. So once tobacco is discovered as a profitable crop in Jamestown and in Virginia, this creates a different economic system that would different from the one that would emerge in New England. So when you're growing tobacco, you need big plots of land. These would often be big plots of land that were owned by one family or one person. You need two things to profit by the growth of tobacco. First, you need big plots of land. Secondly, you need people to work that land. In 1619, you have two important events that happen in this Virginia colony. So first, you have the first Africans that arrive in the colony in 1619. We'll explore that in more detail in a future class. 1619 is also the founding of the House of Burgesses. The House of Burgesses is the earliest English form of self-governance in North America. And we'll talk about that in future classes. It's important to recognize here when we talk about the House of Burgesses and we talk about early politics, we need to recognize that there were very large class differences amongst European people in Virginia in this period. So just because you were from Europe did not entitle you to a full participation in the democracy. The House of Burgesses, the governing bodies of the time, were formed largely by elite plantation owners, people who were wealthy planters, or what scholars call the wealthy planter class. Just shortly after the Jamestown settlement emerged, you begin to see various settlements in what is now called New England, now in the modern day states of Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. The New England colonies began in 1620 with the founding of Plymouth. Unlike the Virginia colony, which was much more of a business and profit-seeking venture, settlement in New England was heavily influenced by religious motives as well as financial gain. The Pilgrims, who were English separatists, were seeking to break from the Church of England, and another group, the Puritans, represented the two largest groups. So there were some differences between the Puritans and the Pilgrims. The Pilgrims were largely about breaking with the Church of England and forming their own community and own religious structure and society in the New World. Puritans were much more about reforming the Church of England. They did not necessarily want to leave the Church of England. They just wanted it to be less like the Catholic Church. So Puritans believed in the idea of predestined grace. They believed that everybody was predetermined to either be saved or to not be saved. So that was an important distinction between other forms of Protestantism and other forms of Christianity. The Puritans also believed strongly in a sense of austerity, plainness, simplicity, not in celebrations, not in dancing, not in the consumption of alcohol, right? That was much more common in cultures that were more Catholic influenced. So let's talk a little bit about some key socioeconomic differences between the settlement in Virginia and the New England colonies. Once again, as we talked about, Virginia was founded by wealthy venture capitalists seeking to make large profits. So there was a built-in sort of class dynamic here, right? That the people who would go on to control politics in Virginia, and some of the most celebrated founding fathers and founding families of the United States, right, can trace their roots back to this time period. In New England, things played out a little bit differently. Most of the people coming to found Plymouth and the other New England settlements were members of what were called the middling landowner class in England. So they had some modest amount of money and land ownership already, and they brought that sensibility to North America and to the founding of the New England colonies. As we mentioned, the success of tobacco and the desire for wealth resulted in large-scale plantations, which resulted in the need for cheap and abundant labor. So in the South in general, and particularly in Virginia in the beginning, the economy was centered around individuals or individual families owning large tracts of farmable land. But they didn't have the families or the populations to farm that land, and that would result eventually in a dependence on chattel slavery, and before chattel slavery, a primary dependence on indentured servitude. Things happened a little bit differently in New England in that sense. In New England, there was already a sense of smaller plots of land being divided up. The New England economy was not centered around crops or growing crops primarily, and it wasn't centered around cash crops like tobacco, which required large plots of land. Instead, there was a sense of smaller land ownership. There was a creation of small towns that were divided up into smaller pieces of land owned by families and individuals. At the same time, there was a recognition that there was a need to distribute land and create common places designated for public use. In other words, today what we might call, public spaces, or what was called in the period commons. Very different from the more individualistic ownership of large plots of land in the South. Tobacco and other cash crops, which thrived in the Virginia climate, drove the system in Virginia. If you stop and think about it, Virginia and the South in general is a much more warm climate, a much warmer climate. Right? New England tends to be a much cooler climate. So the crops that were able to thrive, like tobacco and eventually cotton, rice, and even sugar in the South, were not crops that could be grown easily in New England. So New England develops much less of an agricultural economy, and other small industries like whaling and fishing develop in the New England area. Also, you had much smaller farms, which were not about selling crops for cash so much as it was about being a means of sustaining one's family or an individual. So in Virginia, large tracts of land growing cash crops owned by an individual or family. In New England, smaller pieces of land, smaller farms, and the development of other industries that had nothing or little to do with farming. Lastly, we'll talk about population decrease and population increase. So in Virginia, the climate, although it was much better for growing things like tobacco, it was also a hotter climate, which was much friendlier to natural diseases. So you had much more disease epidemics, in fact, that wiped out parts of the population. So you have an actual decrease in the population in Virginia. So the population of Virginia between 1607 and 1700 actually decreases from 120,000 people to 85,000 people. At the same time, New England was settled by families, and the climate was less prone to disease. So during this period, the population quadrupled by 1700. That means the population expanded 4 times from the early 1600s to 1700s. Another thing we should go back and highlight a little bit is the fact that Virginia was mostly a male endeavor. There was a shortage of women, so there was less population growth. Whereas in New England was settled by families. Women were more common, families were more common, and there were children that were part of the first arrivals. So you had actually a population growth during this period. Okay, finally, we'll just focus in on the fact that although we're talking primarily today and in future classes about English settlements and how that transformed into the United States, we have to take a step back and realize the extent to which other European countries were also heavily involved, much more heavily involved, in fact, in this period in colonizing North America and also South America. So if you take a look at this map very quickly, you'll see that French settlement was much larger and much more commonplace than English settlement, which amounted to this relatively small tract of land in North America, and then settlement north in what is modern day Canada. The same is true when we think about Spanish settlement throughout much of North America and also South America. And we should also throw in Portuguese settlement in eastern South America, or what is eastern South America today. So in this period of time, there is an emerging sense of the importance of colonization and the importance of conquering the New World and of creating settlements. So that happens initially by the French and Spanish. We should also mention the Dutch during this period of time, but then the English get involved in the 1600s. And then in our next class, we'll look at how these English settlements expand and how other English settlements come about in the 16 and 1700s. See you next time. Bye.